Imagine it's 1st of December 2001. You are a 57-year-old toy factory owner living in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Your name is Norberto Garcia, and for years the rhythm of your life has been the rattle of plastic molds, the hiss of old machines, and the smell of cardboard boxes stacked to the ceiling. You keep your working cash in the bank, your emergency dollars in an account you were told was as safe as a locked safe at home, and your faith in a simple promise: 1 peso equals $1. Your wife handles the books at the kitchen table. Your workers expect wages on Friday. And your biggest worry, until this morning, is whether Christmas demand will be strong enough to justify another production run. Outside, the city still looks normal, with buses groaning down Avenida Rivadavia, children in school uniforms on the sidewalks, and shop windows full of imported goods that made people believe Argentina had finally become a rich country again. You do not know it yet, but the floor beneath all of it is already rotten, like a theater stage painted to look solid, while the beams underneath have been eaten hollow. If you have ever wondered how a country can default again and again, trap savings, wreck its own currency, and still refuse to disappear, stay with me. What you are about to hear is not a theory, it is a pattern. It has happened before. It happened in Argentina more than almost anywhere else. And if this kind of historical clarity helps you see the world a little earlier than everyone else, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never notice until it is far too late. That same day, Economy Minister Domingo Cavallo announces the Corralito, the Little Corral, a name that sounds almost harmless until you realize what it means. You can no longer freely take your own money out of the bank. Cash withdrawals are capped at 250 pesos a week. Families line up outside branches that suddenly feel less like banks and more like guarded wells in a drought. Within weeks, people are banging pots in the streets, stores are watching sales collapse by 50 to 70%, supermarkets are being looted, and President Fernando de la Rua will flee the presidential palace by helicopter. By the end of the month, Argentina will default on roughly $100 billion of debt, the largest sovereign default in history at that time. A sovereign default, in plain English, means the government cannot or will not pay what it promised to creditors. But this story is bigger than 2001, much bigger. Argentina has defaulted on its international sovereign debt 9 times since independence, including in 1827, 1890, 1951, 1956, 1982, 1989, 2001, 2014, and 2020. Most countries would be defined forever by one collapse like that. Argentina somehow turned it into a recurring season. The strange part is not just that it kept falling. The strange part is that it kept getting back up. That is what this video is really about. Not simply the country that defaulted 9 times, but the machine underneath those defaults, the human cost of living inside that machine, and the reason the country never quite dies even when history seems certain it should. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. Countries do not usually collapse because one politician wakes up and decides to ruin them. Collapse is almost never a lightning strike. It is more like a dam filling with invisible pressure. Argentina's basic problem, again and again, was simple enough to explain to a child. The state kept making promises in hard currency, usually dollars, while much of the country earned, saved, and paid taxes in weak local money, the peso. That is like getting paid in buckets of water while promising to settle your rent in bricks. When the weather is good, when commodity exports are strong, when foreign investors are cheerful, you can keep swapping your buckets for bricks and pretend the system works. But when drought comes, or fear comes, or interest rates rise abroad, the trade stops working. Now add a second ingredient. Argentina also had a long history of inflation, which means prices rose and the value of money fell. Inflation is not just annoying. It teaches a whole society to distrust its own currency. So people save in dollars if they can. Businesses think in dollars. Politicians borrow in dollars because lenders trust dollars more than pesos. Then comes the trap. The government tries to keep the peso strong to calm everyone down. Imports become cheap. Foreign borrowing feels painless. Cities look richer than they really are. But the country starts spending and promising like a household living on a credit card during one lucky bonus season. When exports slow, or outside money leaves, or the fixed exchange rate becomes impossible to defend, the bill arrives all at once. Taxes fall because the economy is weak. Debt becomes heavier because it is denominated in foreign currency, which means it must be paid in money the country cannot print. The government then has only bad choices. It can cut spending brutally. It can print money and risk even more inflation. It can devalue, which means the peso suddenly buys far less. Or it can default. Every one of those choices hurts ordinary people first. This is the secret key to the whole story. Argentina did not default 9 times because Argentines are uniquely reckless or cursed. It defaulted because the country kept building the same house on the same riverbank, and every few decades the river moved back. This brings us directly to the first part of the pattern. The defaults did not begin with modern populism, modern television, or the IMF. They were there almost from the start. In the 1880s, Argentina looked like one of the great success stories of the world economy. British capital flooded in, railways expanded, Buenos Aires grew into a grand capital with boulevards, theaters, and the confidence of a country convinced it had finally arrived. Money poured in from London to finance land, infrastructure, and public dreams. It felt like the future had already landed on the pampas, but the boom had a fragile heart. Argentina was borrowing heavily from abroad, much of it under the assumption that growth would continue and foreign money would always be available. By 1890, that assumption cracked. The country suspended debt service and defaulted on nearly £48 million of debt, a sum so large that it made up nearly 60% of the world's defaulted debt in the 1890s. That crisis did not stay in Buenos Aires. It shot back across the Atlantic and nearly brought down Baring Brothers, one of the most prestigious merchant banks in London. Imagine one country's borrowing binge shaking the financial center of the world. Argentina managed that in the 19th century. The politics turned violent as finance turned sour. President Miguel Juárez Celman faced the Revolución del Parque in 1890, a civic uprising in Buenos Aires fed by anger over corruption, speculation, and the stench of collapse. He resigned. Carlos Pellegrini took power and tried to stabilize the wreckage. Beneath the political drama was the familiar economic skeleton. Foreign borrowing had financed expansion faster than the domestic economy could safely support it. Confidence vanished. Credit dried up. What had looked like strength was suddenly exposed as dependence. And here's the part people living through it would actually feel. When outside capital leaves, the pain does not arrive as an abstract line on a chart. It arrives as stalled wages, delayed projects, closed businesses, and a quiet panic that spreads from the trading houses to the family table. The glittering city becomes a stage after the audience has gone home. Contractors are not paid. Public works freeze. Banks tighten. The very promise of progress starts to smell like a trick. That is the cruelty of debt booms. They borrow tomorrow's optimism and spend it in today's sunlight. Argentina recovered, eventually. That matters. Wheat, beef, and land still existed. The country still had productive capacity, which means the ability to actually grow and export real things. A nation is not a hedge fund. It does not disappear because bondholders are angry, but the recovery carried a dangerous lesson. Because the country survived, elites could tell themselves the pain had been temporary. The borrowing had merely been excessive, and next time it could be managed better. History sometimes works like a forgiving parent. It lets you survive your mistake, and in doing so, it makes you more likely to repeat it. Here is something I want you to think about before we go further. What would you trust more in a crisis like that? A government's promise, a stack of local banknotes, or a bag of goods you can actually touch? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously. Because what comes next is the part of this story that most people miss. And once you see it, the next Argentine collapse no longer looks like a surprise at all. By the late 20th century, the costume had changed, but the mechanism had not. Argentina had industrialized, urbanized, and politicized itself in new ways. Yet the old distrust of money and the old temptation to outrun weakness with financial tricks were still there. In 1989, the country did not just face a debt problem, it faced hyperinflation, which means prices were rising so fast that money could lose value between breakfast and dinner. Annual inflation ran above 2,600% in both 1989 and 1990. In May 1989 alone, monthly inflation surged to around 80%. Think about that for a second. A worker could be paid on Monday and feel poorer by Friday without buying anything more than food. In Buenos Aires and beyond, prices were being rewritten constantly. Shopkeepers relabeled shelves over and over. Families rushed to spend wages before they evaporated. Savings dissolved like sugar in hot tea. Hyperinflation is not a fire that burns one building. It is acid rain. It falls on every contract, every salary, every pension, every assumption people use to organize normal life. It punishes the careful and rewards the fast, the connected, and the lucky. The roots of that episode went back to deficits, money creation, weak confidence, and the wider Latin American debt crisis after the 1982 shock. Governments that cannot borrow cheaply often turn to the printing press. Printing money sounds like an easy escape until everyone realizes more pieces of paper are chasing the same bread, fuel, and rent. Then prices run ahead, people run after prices, and the entire economy starts behaving like a crowd trying to leave through one narrow door. Ordinary people learned brutal lessons. Cash was not safety, wages were not stability, long-term planning became almost comic. If you were a pensioner, you were crushed. If you were paid monthly, you were constantly behind. If you had access to dollars, property, export income, or inventory that rose with inflation, You had a shield others did not. This was not fairness. It was a survival lottery with economic vocabulary wrapped around it. The government's answer was convertibility. In 1991, the one-to-one peso-dollar peg, designed by Domingo Cavallo. For a while it worked. Inflation collapsed. Imported goods flooded stores. Middle-class Argentines felt like normality had been restored. But the cure contained its own poison. By tying the peso tightly to the dollar, Argentina imported credibility, which means it borrowed the trust it could not generate on its own. The system was like a patient wearing borrowed lungs. As long as the machine kept humming, everything looked calm. But if the machine ever failed, the patient would be weaker than before. And that is exactly what happened. The dollar strengthened in the late 1990s. Brazil devalued in 1999. Argentina became expensive and uncompetitive. Recession deepened. Debt dynamics worsened, meaning slow growth and high interest rates made the debt burden heavier every year. The IMF later pointed to lax fiscal policy, the rigid peg, volatile global capital flows, slow structural reform, political weakness, external shocks, and weakening bank defenses as the mix that turned fragility into disaster. The important part is this: 1989 was not a separate story from 2001. It was the prequel. One disaster taught Argentines to fear inflation. The response taught them to trust a fixed exchange rate, and that trust set the stage for the next implosion. Look at what happened next. In December 2001, the machine broke exactly where it was weakest: the banks, the currency peg, and public faith. People had been told for years that one peso really was $1. Then suddenly the state treated depositors not like owners of money, but like crowds that had to be fenced in. The Corralito froze roughly $40 billion in deposits and capped cash access. Long lines formed outside banks. ATMs became objects of rage. Savers hammered on shutters and shouted, "Coros, thieves, give back our savings." When money becomes inaccessible, trust vanishes faster than cash. The social collapse was immediate. Over 24 people were killed in the bloody protests of December 2001, and later counts placed the toll around 40. President de la Rua resigned and fled by helicopter on 27 December. On 23 December, interim President Adolfo Rodriguez Sá declared default. In January 2002, President Eduardo Duhalde abandoned convertibility and the peso was quickly devalued. What had been sold as certainty turned into a trapdoor. The same families who had trusted the system found their dollar accounts converted into pesos, while prices for essentials were resetting all around them. The numbers tell the story, but they still do not capture the feeling of it. By the end of 2002, Argentina's economy had contracted by 20% from the start of the recession in 1998. Poverty rose from 37% in 2001 to 58% by the end of 2002. Unemployment peaked at 22% in May 2002. Between October 2001 and May 2002, roughly 825,000 jobs were lost, and 90% of them were formal jobs, the kind people thought were secure. Families cut milk and sugar, replaced meat with soy, noodles, or rice, reduced spending on school materials, and in many cases lost access to medicine because they could not afford the fees or the transport. This was not only an economic event, it was a psychological demolition. Historian Felipe Piña described the period as one of orphanhood and distrust. That word matters. Orphanhood. People did not just lose money, they lost the sense that any institution was really there to protect them. In some neighborhoods, barter clubs spread across the country and reached more than 1.5 million people. In others, families made bread at home, shared wholesale purchases, or illegally tapped electricity because basic services had become too expensive. The formal economy shrank, so society built makeshift bridges over the ruins. And yet, once again, Argentina did not disappear. After the devaluation, exports became more competitive. Commodity prices helped. Growth returned in the mid-2000s. That rebound is one of the most misunderstood parts of the story. Many outsiders saw recovery and assumed default itself had been the medicine. It was not that simple. Default removed one pressure, devaluation shifted another. A global commodity boom offered oxygen, but the deep habits of fiscal weakness, currency distrust, and political short-termism were never fully cured. The roof had been patched while the beams remained damp. Now observe what all of these cases have in common. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep trusting systems they do not understand. If you are still here, you are not most people. Hit subscribe. Because the next section is the part this channel was made for, the part they never put in textbooks. The same mechanism, different countries, different decades, same result. In 1890, Argentina borrowed abroad as if access to London money would never end. In 1989, the state tried to escape weakness through money creation until inflation ate the currency alive. In 2001, it tried to import stability by chaining the peso to the dollar until recession and debt snapped the chain. Different costumes, same plot. The country repeatedly tried to solve a credibility problem with a financial shortcut. Once you see that, later episodes stop looking random. In 2014, Argentina entered what many called a technical default, meaning the government had funds, but legal conflict with holdout creditors blocked payment to restructured bondholders. About 2% of bondholders held out, and a U.S. court ruling meant paying them in full risked triggering claims that some analysts said could run from $120 billion to $500 billion under the Rufo Clause. The state chose confrontation and slid into default again. That was not the same as 2001. Debt was not as obviously unsustainable. But the old pattern was visible: weak credibility, legal rigidity, and politics shaping financial outcomes. Then came 2018. Argentina turned back to the IMF and received the largest program in the institution's history, $57 billion, of which $44.5 billion would later have to be restructured. 2 years later, in May 2020, after a 30-day grace period expired on $503 million in missed interest payments, the country defaulted again on about $65 billion of foreign law debt and then restructured it. September 2020 formally closed that ninth default. The calendar changed, the choreography did not. What makes Argentina unusual is not that it suffered one bad decade. Many countries have done that. Greece shut its banks in 2015 and limited ATM withdrawals to 60 euros a day. Lebanon locked depositors out of dollar accounts after 2019 and forced many to take local currency withdrawals at rates that implied losses of around 70% versus the street market. Germany in 1923 saw the mark go from 160 to the dollar in early 1922 to 4.2 trillion to the dollar by November 1923. These places are different, their politics are different, their institutions are different. But when states make rigid promises they cannot keep, when banking systems rely on confidence more than resilience, and when money itself loses credibility, the human script begins to rhyme. At this point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Default is rarely the first injury. It is the final public confession. The real damage begins earlier, when a society starts living between currencies, between promises, between official stories, and private survival plans. In Argentina, millions of people learned to speak one language in public and another in private. They earned in pesos, saved in dollars, trusted neither completely, and watched politics swing between denial and emergency. That double life is exhausting. It is like living in a house where every room has a different floor level. You can move through it, but never without stumbling. And this is where history gets uncomfortable. The people hurt most are almost never the people who designed the system. Middle-class savers get trapped because they believe official guarantees. Pensioners get crushed because fixed incomes move slowly while prices move fast. Small business owners get hit from both sides because costs rise while customers disappear. Workers in the formal sector, the people with payslips and tax records, often discover that legality is not protection at all. In Argentina's 2001-2002 collapse, formal workers made up most of the 825,000 jobs lost in a 7-month stretch. In the years after, many families survived only by moving into the informal economy, which means work outside the official system, usually with less security and fewer protections. Look at the social map more closely. During the 2002 crisis, the unemployment rate among the indigent in Argentina was close to 35%, compared with 21% for the moderate poor and 10% for the non-poor. Poverty did not rise evenly. It fell hardest on households already standing near the cliff edge. Families reported reducing food quality, delaying healthcare, and cutting spending on school supplies. Civil society groups reported more family violence, alcoholism, crime, depression, and hopelessness. Economic crises do not stay inside economics. They leak into kitchens, marriages, school attendance, and the nervous system. Small business owners often sit in the eye of this storm. Norberto Garcia, the toy factory owner from the opening of this story, later remembered shutting down machines, laying off most staff, and selling property at knockdown prices just to survive. Others with stores or workshops watched credit vanish, customers evaporate, and imported inputs become unaffordable overnight. A business is like a bicycle. If it stops moving, it does not stand upright for long. In default episodes, thousands of otherwise viable firms fail not because their products are useless, but because the financial plumbing around them has turned to stone. Who tends to walk away less damaged? Not untouched, just less damaged. Historically, it is often people with hard assets, flexible income, low debt, export exposure, or savings outside the local banking trap. During crises, farmland still produces, inventories can sometimes be repriced, and dollar income remains a shield when peso income melts. In 2014, one Argentine accountant told Reuters he had avoided the worst of the 2001 collapse because his distrust of banks led him to keep dollars elsewhere, and later he was able to buy an apartment when property prices fell sharply in dollar terms. That is not a moral tale about virtue. It is a cold lesson about asymmetry. In every monetary breakdown, some people are standing in the rain and some happen to be under a roof. The same is visible elsewhere. When Greek banks closed in 2015, retirees queued at cash machines, while those with foreign cards had more flexibility. In Lebanon, depositors who had trusted banks for decades found that access to their own dollars had become conditional, delayed, and deeply discounted. This is why confidence is the most underrated asset in any financial system. A bank is not a vault filled with each depositor's money in a labeled box. It is a network of claims built on the assumption that not everyone will ask for the same thing at once. Once that assumption cracks, the whole building starts sounding hollow. The historical record shows that those who came through Argentina's repeated breakdowns largely shared three characteristics. First, they understood that official calm is often a late-stage signal, not a guarantee. By the time leaders insist there is no problem, the pressure is usually already in the walls. Second, they valued flexibility over appearances. They kept optionality, which means room to move. Low debt, multiple income sources, liquid assets, and the ability to change plans quickly mattered more than status. Third, they trusted productive reality more than financial theater. Land, export businesses, useful inventory, strong local networks, and practical skills repeatedly outperformed paper promises when paper promises were the very thing breaking apart. Notice what that does not mean. It does not mean there was a magic asset that saved everyone. It does not mean every person who bought dollars was wise or every person who trusted banks was foolish. History is messier than that. Plenty of careful, decent, informed people were still caught in these storms because systems can fail faster than individual prudence can respond. But the survivors tended to avoid one dangerous habit. They did not confuse temporary stability with permanent repair. Argentina's own political class often made that mistake. After one crisis, a commodity boom made the system look healthier than it was. After another, a new peg made confidence look restored. After another, debt restructuring bought time, and leaders spent that time as if time itself were reform. Yet a restructuring is not a cure, it is an extension. A devaluation is not a strategy, it is a reset. An IMF program is not credibility, it is rented credibility. If the underlying fiscal and monetary institutions remain weak, the next cycle begins before the last one is emotionally over. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. If this channel helps you think differently about the world you live in, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it might change everything. There is one more layer to this story that explains why Argentina can survive repeated crises without ever quite escaping them. In 2020, Brookings described the country as a kind of 2080 society. Out of every 100 working-age Argentines at the end of 2019, about 35 were inactive, meaning not looking for work, 6 were unemployed, 15 worked in the informal sector, 14 were registered as self-employed, often in low-income or subsidized work, and 10 were public sector workers. Only about 20 were stable private sector workers, supporting a system that had to carry the other 80. You do not need an economics degree to feel the weight of that. It is like asking 2 strong beams to hold up an entire roof, after termites have already weakened the frame. That imbalance helps explain why each rescue feels temporary. Social spending rises because poverty is real. Taxes rise because the state needs revenue. Investment weakens because investors expect future taxes or future inflation. Growth then slows, which creates even fewer productive jobs, which deepens dependence on subsidies and emergency programs. In 2020, roughly 9 million people received Argentina's emergency family income during the pandemic. In 2022 and 2023, the country was still dealing with inflation, drought damage to exports, and depleted dollar reserves. In other words, the past was not gone. It was still breathing through the present. The old machine had been repaired just enough to keep running, not enough to stop rattling. There is also a deeper reason Argentina keeps surviving what would bury smaller states. The country is not empty. It has fertile land, agricultural exports, human capital, major cities, industry, and a society with an extraordinary talent for adaptation. Even in collapse, people improvise, they barter, they reprice, they emigrate and send money home. They create parallel habits of trust when official trust fails. That resilience is admirable. It is also dangerous because resilience can become an excuse for not fixing the structure. A ship with a hard-working crew can stay afloat longer than expected. That does not mean the hole in the hull is imaginary. So go back to Norberto Garcia in Buenos Aires on 1st December 2001. He thought he was running a toy factory. In reality, he was standing inside the 9th chapter of a much older national argument about money, trust, and time. He survived. Argentina survived. The country devalued, defaulted, restructured, and carried on. In the years that followed, growth returned, then faded, then returned, then faded again. In 2020, after another default and another restructuring, Argentina formally exited default number 9. The nation was still there, still exporting soy and beef, still arguing about the peso, still haunted by the corralito, still alive. That is the final lesson. Countries do not disappear the way companies do. They absorb pain into households, memory, and politics. They survive by shifting losses through society, through inflation, through devaluation, through unemployment, through broken expectations. Argentina did not beat the laws of economics. It paid them over and over in human installments. That is why its history matters far beyond South America. It shows how a nation can remain standing while trust, savings, and normal life are repeatedly stripped for parts. The building stays up. The rooms inside become harder to live in. History does not tell us what will happen next. It does something more useful. It tells us what recurring stress looks like, what kind of promises fail first, and who usually bears the cost when they do. Argentina's 9 defaults are not an exotic national quirk. They are a long case study in what happens when a society tries to solve deep institutional weakness with temporary financial design. The country still refuses to disappear because nations are more durable than markets. But history shows durability is not the same thing as health. And perhaps that is why Argentina stays so difficult to forget. It keeps proving that survival and recovery are not the same thing. Survival means the flag still flies, the ports still ship grain, and the state still functions. Recovery means families can trust tomorrow enough to save, borrow, hire, and dream without fearing the floor will vanish again. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. Please consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision. This video is not for everyone. Most people will dismiss it. But if one person in your life needs to hear this, share it with them. Not because it will change the world, because it might change their world. Subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one.